It's nice to be here today with you, and I want to thank you for inviting me to make two presentations on what I feel is the founder of one of the most important families in American history, but probably one of the least known of the founders that we can think of. And I want to congratulate Hugh Campbell and Candy Kelly for doing so much work in organizing this event today, not only this morning but this afternoon, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the renovation of Smithfield, and we also have a Preston family reunion. As I begin, I want to find out how many of you are here because you are somehow related to the Preston family. I'm in big trouble. Because some of you probably know a lot more about this family than I do, because you were born into it. But it is an honor to talk about it. I spent 7 years of my life working on a dissertation at the University of Maryland on this individual. And I'll have to be honest, that was 20 years ago, and since then, because of being a busy administrator, I haven't had time to do a lot more with my research, even though my committee at the time said, you need to get this published. I understand that you can buy copies of the dissertation at Smithfield today, and you may want to do that if you want to find out more about the person that founded this famous family that many of you are part of here this morning. And I don't want to have you see this as a formal, historical, scholarly paper, fully footnoted, but more of a talk. And I'll be sharing quite a few quotes because I think some of the flavor of William Preston and those writing to him come out in some of the actual quotes that will be helpful. We see here, of course, the famous coat of arms of the Preston family. And as you come into Blacksburg, you see this marker. 1 mile west is Smithfield, old home of Colonel William Preston, who materially guided the destiny of the Virginia frontier from the French and Indian War through the Revolution. On this estate, 2 Virginia governors were born, James Preston, John Floyd. The latter was son of another Virginia governor, John Floyd, who, while in office, advocated before the legislature the abolition of slavery in Virginia. In very brief, précis form, that summarizes the life of William Preston. It talks about his contribution to this part of the world, but it also talks about his ongoing legacy as the founder of the Preston family. And it's represented even today through many of you in this room. If you look at his family and his grandchildren, his own children, his nieces and nephews, it's a remarkable life of service. But it took more than William. And I'm going to be stressing today the important role of his wife, Susanna, because I think that is also critical in why William Preston was the way he was as a frontier leader. Now, when I first began studying this, I began to look at the remarkable legacy of this family. Now, first of all, think about the fact that they had 12 children, and 11 of them made it into adulthood. One of them died at 13. Think about those times and what was the likelihood of a family being able to have that many children actually survive into adulthood. This family had very strong genes on both sides of the family, with many of the children surviving. And you can see here that 6 of those 11 children served or married someone that was in the Virginia House of Delegates or the Senate. Why is that important? You have to understand that at that time, Virginia was dominated by the Tidewater, and gradually power was moving to the Piedmont, or they were giving up some power, but rarely did you find a frontier family having this kind of influence and power. Very unusual. I discovered that in my study of the establishment of religious freedom in Virginia, that as you went through the years, you could see some power beginning to move west, maybe into the Piedmont, but rarely did you see a frontier family become like this. They had a son who became treasurer, another son, governor, a daughter married another person that became the governor. And some of these figures are related to individuals that daughters married or were also the male individuals we're talking about. 25 of the grandchildren served in state legislatures. 2 were state governors, 2 ambassadors, a secretary of the Navy, a secretary of the War, the president of the University of Mississippi. The great-grandchildren, you had 8 elected to state legislatures, 5 to the U.S. Congress, 2 were state governors, including a granddaughter that was married to California Governor John Weller. Another great-granddaughter married someone that we've all heard of, John Fremont, who was the California conqueror and the nominee for the Radical Republicans for President of the United States. There were nephews and nieces, like John Breckinridge, who became an attorney general. There was a grandnephew who was a vice president of the United States, another John Breckinridge, and a presidential candidate for Southern Democrats. Then there was a grandnephew, Francis Preston Blair, who was nominated to be the vice president of the U.S. on the Democratic ticket. And we'll talk more about Blair House. Governor Blair Lee probably is the most recent that I know, and family members can probably tell me others, but I was living in Maryland at the time when Marvin Mandel was in all of his troubles as governor, and Blair Lee took over, and he's another direct descendant. And you can probably give us other names as we talk here today. So how did I get involved in writing a biography of William Preston? As Hugh has already mentioned, I wrote actually a 400-page master's thesis, if you can believe that, on the establishment of religious freedom. My doctoral dissertation was shorter than my master's thesis. But when it came time, and normally in a doctoral program, you would just continue studying what you did for your master's. But a Jesuit priest had written a great history of the religious freedom establishment in Virginia. And I was grading papers as a high school principal for Emory Evans, who was chair of the history department. He knew I was interested in Virginia. He was a Virginia scholar. He said, "Why don't you take a look at William Preston?" He said, "There's a lot of papers out there, and there's really not been any scholar that's taken a strong look at William Preston." There was a regional author, Patricia Givens Johnson, who wrote some remarkable biographies for so many figures in this period. Several of them was very helpful to me, but no PhD-trained scholar had actually looked at Preston. And so Dr. Evans said, "Why don't you take a look at William Preston?" He knew that there were literally thousands of papers of the Preston family. The Library of Congress, the Virginia Historical Society, the College of William and Mary, the Filson Club in Louisville, Kentucky, the Preston Davy Collection, probably the most important, the Draper Collection at the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. It was interesting, when I was doing my research at the Filson Club, I had spent a week there. I had been putting off going through the Draper papers because it was several microfilms, and those of you who have worked with microfilm know how tedious it is, trying to figure out what's been written and sort out the handwriting. And as we were sitting there, the archivist, Jim Holberg, casually pointed to a cabinet and said, "You might be interested in those 3 or 4 volumes there." I pulled them down. One of your family had paid a professional transcriber to actually transcribe the entire collection. Now my job was to talk Jim into copying about 1,500 pages of material. And at 50 cents a page, it was worth it because it saved me probably 6 months of research. I was not able to locate that anywhere else in the Filson Club. Couldn't even get it on interlibrary loan anywhere. And so it was one of those serendipitous moments where it was just like, you might be interested in that. I really was interested in that. And so I got to work going through these sources because your family saved just about everything. I mean, receipts and documents, you name it, it was saved and then put on microfilm by various individuals. And I'll allude to why that may have been the case later on. I want to thank Hugh for publishing one of my chapters in 2 issues in the Smithfield Review, this really outstanding regional historical journal. And then there's another online peer-reviewed journal called the Journal of Backcountry Studies, put out from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, that actually put online my whole dissertation about 2 or 3 years ago. And so it's been interesting to see 20 years after I finished this to see this kind of interest. So what I'm going to do today is 3 things. I'm going to present a brief overview of the life of William and Susanna Preston. Then I'm going to focus on several themes that their lives illustrate the importance in the founding of 3 counties and their leadership role in the years leading up to the Revolution. And then I want to highlight some family characteristics that I think helped establish this ongoing legacy of public service that's very remarkable for a family that was located on the edge of the Virginia frontier. We know that William Preston was born on Christmas Day in 1729 in Ireland, of Scottish origin. Many of you know about the whole idea of Scotch-Irish and the fact that that was not a term used at that time, only in the 1850s did it come to be used, but that's really what he was. And his father, John Preston, was a simple cabinet maker who married above his station in life to Elizabeth Patton and basically was ostracized from her family for marrying someone of such low status. But her brother-in-law, James Patton, never did reject his sister, and he moved here to Virginia basically to be involved in land deals. You have to understand, economic conditions in Ireland were very difficult. As Presbyterians, they were different in terms of their religion than everyone else. And the Patton family, except for James, didn't like John Preston, so that was another reason for them to get out of town. And the other thing is that these sons, especially James, who was a younger son, wasn't going to inherit any land because he was a younger son. So at 9 years of age, William Preston, in 1738, they move to this area of Virginia to join Uncle James, who's trying to get family members to purchase land in Virginia. They land in Alexandria, Virginia, and they begin to make their way to Stanton, Virginia by renting pack horses, following the trails through the gaps in the Blue Ridge Mountains, killing bountiful game along the way to sustain themselves. The area of Stanton was very attractive to them because it was much like the climate they came from. But we have to realize it was difficult. Roads were basically non-existent or very bad. They started the backbreaking work of erecting primitive log cabins, clearing the fields, harvesting simple crops, and dealing with Indian attacks. They soon started an ordinary, a tavern. And so William early on began to see the social interchange that would go on because this is where people talked and conversed and did their business deals. After his father died, William's mother, Elizabeth, who was a very powerful influence in his life, entrusted him at 19 years of age the care of her brother, James Patton. And he became the son that he never had, while his mother, Elizabeth, was overseeing the marriage of his 4 sisters. Now you have to understand the relationship between Patton and Preston, because of Patton's wife, was tenuous. She thought that William wanted to get all of his wealth and was very suspicious of him. And it wasn't until actually she died that the relationship was very firmly established between the two of them. At 21 years of age, William is elected with the influence of his uncle to his first public position as a vestryman, 1750, serving as a clerk. You see, the elite would usually pick their successors, and these vestries were self-perpetuating, so they chose the people that would follow them, and this is their way of perpetuating their power. 8 of the 12 in this vestry were Presbyterians in a colony that had an established church. But the vestry had more to do than run the church. It had a lot of other responsibilities. And so William, his first position is on the vestry. Now, one of the most important themes dominating William's life was the ownership of land. And by 20 years of age, he already owned 1,000 acres. In 2 years of ownership, he sold his first parcel of land of 334 acres for 60 pounds, which was a 600% profit in that first sale of his land. And he was already part of the elite because there were only 8 others in that colony that had more land than he had at 20 years of age. To become even more profitable, he learned the craft of surveying because that's what Uncle James did. He was the county surveyor. He already knew math, but then he mastered the use of a compass and a chain to become an assistant surveyor by actually going out into the field and getting training in the field. It was hard work. Let me give you an example. In 8 weeks in 1751, he surveyed 42 pieces of property, 20 in a 17-day period. He could make somewhere between 70 to 80 pounds a year from these surveys at an early age. And you can imagine that was a lot of money back then. And then he got another 5 pounds from his work on the vestry. So he was already on his way to becoming part of the elite, even in his early 20s. In this work, he could also, as a surveyor, find the best lands for himself, which is what surveyors did. Scout out what was the best for them and make it hard, really, for other people to get the prime lands because they knew what the best lands were. Now, on the frontier, there were 6 ways to own land, and I'm moving ahead in the story so I can illustrate my point here. In his life, I was able to calculate that he actually owned 46,000 acres of land. When he died, he owned 20,000. That means he did a lot of dealing in those years. And so when I give these figures, what I'm doing is I'm telling you the first is his total lands, and the second is what was actually in his estate at the end. In his inheritance, in all of his lands, it was 7%, but at his death, it represented 14% of his estate, lands that he inherited. Then, of course, there were head rights, 50 acres for each person that came over, which was significant. Then there were something called treasury rights, and those were the most popular and the cheapest. You would purchase those from a surveyor at a cost of 5 shillings per 5 acres, and then the surveyor would survey them and then get them lodged at Williamsburg, and you can see that that was the largest part of his estate, 52% of it. Then there were land warrants from the military, from fighting, from being part of that. They would throw out incentives. You know, if you'll go on this expedition, we'll give you so many acres of land. And I wasn't able to calculate that. And then he just outright purchased 34% of his estate over the years. And then there were debts. People would pay off their debts by giving land to other individuals. Now, land procurement was central in the lives of frontiersmen. Whether you were a subsistence farmer, renting lands, or you were working for a landowner, having your own land was a dream, your own property. And this was the central quest for most frontiersmen. It wasn't easy for a common person to get lands. And as I said, the surveyors often had little incentive. But another key factor here is that there was a lack of permanence in the land. When the Germans moved into the valley, they settled down with other Germans and they stayed on those lands. For the Scotch-Irish, it was a commodity. And that's why they kept moving to better lands. It was part of the deal that went along with it. And this also led to conflict with Indians, who didn't see, and the French, who didn't see land in a permanent kind of a way where you settled down. It wasn't like the Scotch-Irish, who were just buying and purchasing and then trying to set it up so that there would be something for the children to inherit, which was another key part of William's life. Now, early on, William patterned his life after Uncle James by eventually becoming, just as his uncle did, a county surveyor, a justice of the peace, a sheriff, and a vestryman. There were 2 things that led you to be part of the elite. One was holding these offices. Another was owning land. And he saw his uncle holding all of these offices. And when William then founded 3 counties, Botetourt and Castle and Montgomery, he patterned his uncle in each of these counties with these same positions, which gave him a lot of power and influence as these counties were being established. But in each of these, he actually surpassed the success of his uncle. So we see here one of the themes I want to stress, and that is family modeling. Many of you are who you are because of the modeling that has taken place in the Preston family for generations. And it started with Uncle James, as he modeled to this young man who was entrusted to his care to be the son he never had, and then it has patterned itself into your own lives for generations. Another prevailing theme at this time, of course, was the threat of Indians. Native Virginia Indians virtually were non-existent at this time, but they would pass through Virginia because these were their hunting grounds, and if there were settlers there, that was a threat to them because the settlers didn't want them coming through to hunt in their areas. Then they also got involved with the French trying to get them on their side, and then during the Revolution, the British trying to get them on their side. And so a lot of this internal conflict was a result not only of the philosophy of land ownership, but it was a result of being caught up in the French and Indian War between the French and the British, and then the American Revolution, the British trying to get the Indians on their side, and the tribes would then be going against each other, the Cherokees and the Shawnees, and they would switch sides, and it would be very, very complicated. But why do I say that it dominated the psyche? There was this constant fear that you might be attacked if you were on the frontier. And if I was to be politically correct and put myself into the minds of the Indians, you can understand how, if you put it from their perspective, these were their traditional hunting grounds. And to have that taken away from them was a major threat to them also. But then they get caught up, as I said, between these various elements. William, in his early 20s, that's the mid-1750s, was one of the earliest challenges. Was in 1754, George Washington went to construct a fort, but the French got there first, and eventually he built Fort Necessity. You've read all of these stories about Washington, and he was defeated. General Braddock also suffered a defeat with the French. So then, this is the reason why I want to mention this. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia then asks them to raise a company of rangers under his uncle James, who was a lieutenant colonel. And so Preston, first time, recruits 52 volunteers in 1754 to help take on this problem of the Indians. Now, it was always, and this is another theme of his life, difficult to recruit individuals to be militiamen. Why was that? If you left your home and your wife and children were there exposed by themselves, would you voluntarily do that? And so there was also this problem of giving that. And what if you were a farmer and you had to give up your livelihood for several weeks? What if it was during planting season or harvesting season and you were suddenly taken away and you were asked to be a militiaman? You can see on a personal family level that those were real challenges to that. Now I'm going to move up to 1755, and this is at Draper's Meadow, and it's right around this area. Uncle James goes unprotected. I don't know why he left the group of the militia he was with, but he ends up at Draper's Meadow and he's killed there. I'll talk more about that this afternoon, and I'm trying to avoid in this talk themes that I'm going to talk about this afternoon when we talk about Smithfield. So I'm going to leave quite a bit out as we go along here. So now Preston is on his own. He's had the great mentoring. He still has a wonderful mother who's a very important influence on his life. But what he does now is he founds 3 counties, these 3 that we've already mentioned, and in each of these counties he serves as the justice of the peace, the sheriff, the land surveyor, and the captain of the militia. And so again, it's through this ownership of land and the holding of these offices that he gains so much influence, perhaps the most important figure in this part of Virginia for quite a period of time. Very briefly, his role in the American Revolution, there are several themes that dominate his life. He was the leader of the Patriot leaders. He was the leader that the Patriot leaders looked to for help. Even though at the beginning of the Revolution there were people that questioned whether he was a patriot or not. In fact, he was harshly attacked by his critics, saying that he was really a loyalist. And he had to defend himself against these charges because in the period leading right up to the Revolution, he had cooperated with the governor on trying to find some compromises and trying to find some land deal results that people said, you are a loyalist, you're not loyal to the patriot cause. But I think most of you know that he was one of the signers of the Fincastle resolutions and probably even wrote part of it. It may have just been his enemies that were jealous of his power and his land ownership, that this was a way of them coming back and attacking him by throwing those kinds of labels on someone like this. Interesting how in politics today sometimes the same sorts of things happen, isn't it? Isn't that the case? Life repeats itself here. Now, after he proved his loyalty, it was his service as the colonel of the militia that really dominated his life during this period, because he couldn't be out surveying land during the Revolution because of what was going on. There were more loyalists, they said, in this part of Virginia than any other part of Virginia. Almost a civil war taking place, not like the big Civil War, but almost a civil war taking place in this part of Virginia. And Preston trying to keep things calm so that the rest of Virginia could focus on the bigger war and they wouldn't have to bring soldiers here to keep the Indians under control, who were also being used by the British, and the Loyalists, And there was one big thing right here that was so important. It was the lead mines, where Virginia was getting a lot of its ammunition. So Preston's greatest contribution probably was keeping this place fairly quiet, this county, so that the rest of Virginia could focus on the other effort. He was a failure at recruiting militiamen. I mean, there were so many loyalists here, he couldn't get anyone to volunteer, or very, very few. It was a very big challenge. One of the ways he did this, though, was through very skillful leadership. You know, there was something called loyalty oaths. And Preston tried to use a moderate approach to dealing with the loyalists. Let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. And when they were actually proven to be loyalists, they'd work deals out where, well, if your son serves, we won't put you in jail. We won't whip you. We won't do whatever we're supposed to do. And so he was able to keep the loyalists kind of under control by his moderate approaches, which took an issue off of the table that Virginia had to worry about while they were sending soldiers to fight the bigger revolution. I think if Preston were to analyze his role in the revolution, he probably would have considered himself a failure. His one quest to take soldiers out down to South Carolina was a failure. Troops came back tattered and worn, and many of them left in terrible conditions. Another thing that he did is that by staying at Smithfield through the revolution, rather than being out, he was a force of stability. He was a symbol to the rest of this area of stability. And think about Susanna being here under those conditions. And sometimes he was gone, and she was here by herself with her children, having to then be a symbol to other frontiersmen not to leave their homes, to stay by. So I think Preston's major contribution during the Revolution wasn't so much what he contributed to the soldiers that were fighting. It wasn't to the number of militia he raised. It was the stability that Smithfield established for the rest of this county. And it was the force of moderation that he had with loyalists that I think was so crucial in the American Revolution. Now, when Preston died, he had amassed an estate of 20,513 acres, $7,562 of personal property. He had 42 slaves and 273 volumes in his library. You might wonder why I'm mentioning library. And that's going to get us to the last two themes that I want to talk about today. How is it that he became part of the frontier elite? How is it that he created this legacy that has gone on for so many decades? I think the first theme I want to talk about is the role of women in his life. It was very powerful, and I think it was incredibly positive for William. As I mentioned, William's mother, Elizabeth, married down. So she came from a background with more privilege, and she had given up a lot to leave her gentry family. She was described later as having qualities of, you have to understand the language from those times, masculine understanding, great ambition, impetuosity of temper, humble fortunes which she brought on herself by marrying a ship carpenter were powerfully resisted. He grew up in a family that was dominated by women. 4 sisters, 7 of his 12 children who were female. But it took him a long time to find Susanna. He was a good catch. He was 5'11", ruddy, fair hair, hazel eyes. According to family members, there's a quote, his manners were easy and graceful. He had a well-cultivated intellect and a fine taste of poetry. And I would add, he was very wealthy. One of the most eligible bachelors in the county. Now in 1754, we get the first inkling of romance when he wrote in his survey after one of his extensive trips, then, away, 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 wealth to the inexpressible pleasure of William Preston, a former devotee who bowed to the shrine of Venus. At 30 years of age, he still wasn't married, and his friends looked on this with amusement. David Robinson, who was a close friend and a fellow militia officer, wrote this about his prowess. whilst I am examining the comments, you no doubt are trying to, with equal anxiety, whether you can kiss a girl 60 times in a minute. A glorious enterprise indeed. However incredible it may appear, this was actually undertaken by Captain Preston and effected in less than half a minute. I have known you in the silent watches of the night slip out of your bed as by some secret impulse and repair to a certain corner where I could easily discover you. 'Twould be too tedious to tell you the story of the girl you surprised once in the chest and your ingenious conduct on that occasion, the beau monde in the proper sense. You have made yourself acquainted with every young woman's face and leg in the county and know well how to appear agreeable. Does this sound like 18th century, something like Entertainment Tonight or something? John Madison reported on how William had combined his survey trips with a hunt for a wife by interrogating Billy Anderson, an orphan that had been taken in by William's father, who traveled with William on his survey trips. Billy, dear, he's talking to Billy Anderson. Where did your master lodge the first night? Michael Wood's, the next at Dr. Allegra's? Very well. I suppose the next at Mr. Unwood's? Billy answered in the affirmative. Very well. Had he any likely hussies of daughters? Billy assented to that. Might well. Did your master eye them? No answer to that. Well, you're a sly dog. I suppose the next night you reached Colonel Henry's or one Woodson's, but I think Billy landed you at Newcastle, sent you church, only let you call at the Colonel's on your way up, and I don't remember whether you saw Miss Jenny or not. In short, your footsteps have been had and all that could be, but from Billy's ambiguous answers, the old gentleman is still in doubt. It is but a step. Come down and clear up your character. He eventually found Susanna. It was the daughter of a contractor that he had gone to build the Episcopal Church in Stanton. He was attracted to her by her beauty and manners, and unlike most females at the time, she had been educated by the Reverend Patrick Henry. They married in 1761 and they moved to Greenfield, where they built a fine home, and we'll talk more about that this afternoon. David Robinson, who wrote the earlier account, congratulated Williams and said, I shall not say one word about WMN, as it would nowadays be very impertinent. When you look at the home, Smithfield, and we'll talk more about that this afternoon, you can see this was probably her dream house. And this afternoon we'll talk about the comparison between Greenfield and Smithfield. And you can realize that the women in his life brought a level of sophistication, culture, and refinement that contrasted to their neighbors and the surrounding homes, which would have been log cabin shacks. So women were very important in Preston's life, beginning with his mother, his sisters, his very incredible wife, Susanna, and his daughters. The last theme I want to focus on is the role of religion and education in the founding of this frontier elite. Perhaps the most important reason for this family's success came from the role religion and education played in not just his house, but the Presbyterian homes of Scotch-Irish. The Presbyterian religion was important in a colony that was dominated by at least a nominal membership in the Church of England. William's father helped the building of a church early, and the family attended church on a weekly basis since it was close by, but others enjoyed itinerant pastors. And in fact, William's family had to enjoy itinerant preachers when they lived at Greenfield and Smithfield during those years. He was in a quest to try to find a preacher that could come more permanently. And of course, one of his brothers-in-law was a preacher, a Presbyterian preacher, and some of the most joyous occasions of the family were when he would come and spend a week and do a lot of preaching when he was there. Presbyterians believed in the importance of establishing a church and a school at the same time, with the pastor providing the leadership to both. Now, after William's father died, his uncle James made sure that James Craig, who was the pastor of the Tinkling Spring Church, became William's tutor at 19 years of age. Because of his older age, he received a more practical education in subjects like history, mathematics, and penmanship, in contrast to a strong emphasis on Latin and Greek studies that would have been offered in a more normal grammar school. He was so religious that his grandson, Thomas Preston, recalls from family talk that some felt that William should have gone into the ministry, but they felt he was too old and that it would take longer to become a preacher. And of course, in this part of the world, there were other things to be done. But that illustrates the level of piety that he had, that he would have even considered that as a possible career. Now, the choice of this pastor, Craig, by Patton, illustrated the importance he placed on education because these two men hated each other. Craig's autobiography recounts two incidents of pettiness. As sheriff of the county, Patton had him arrested by a constable on a Sunday morning just before services to be questioned at another location about a runaway slave he knew nothing about. And this is what Craig said was Pattons' purpose: to terrify and affront me and provoke me to speak something in passion whereof he might accuse me and drive me from my charge, and all this because I would not become his creature to serve his interest. On another occasion, Patton had Craig arrested at a time when his wife was only 5 weeks from delivering their first child. His wife became terrified, but Craig had no choice but to go the 14 miles to Patton's place. And after asking him some trifling questions, Craig returned to his pregnant wife, but for the remainder of the pregnancy, she remained, to quote Craig, in very low condition, during which time almost every night, and sometimes for the post part of the night, I had to sit and hold her arms, often not knowing whether she was living or dead. Now, why do I tell you that? In spite of that background, this is the man Patton entrusted Preston's education to, because he was the best educated man around to give him an education, and that was so important for Uncle James that William receive a good education. Who was Craig? He had received a liberal education in Ireland, far advanced for his time, even graduating with a Master's of Arts from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 1733. After teaching school in Pennsylvania, he became pastor of the Tinkling Springs Church for 36 years. Now, I want to mention a theme here that Lawrence Kremen, who's an educational historian, talks about, and it makes a point I want to make about the Preston family. He talks about the difference between inert literacy, that's just the basic skills of learning how to read and write, and a liberating literacy, in which a growing technical competence is combined with expanding motivation, expanding need, and expanding opportunity. And so what you see in the Preston family is not just that inert literacy, read, write, and move on, but it's this liberating literacy that motivates you to be a lifelong learner, motivates you to read, to talk about things of educational value to other people. And that's what Preston had. He had a liberating literacy. And that's what many of you have inherited from many decades of this trait in the Preston family, of going beyond the fundamental levels of just learning how to read and write. Craig believed in the importance of diligence, persistence, care, patience, fearlessness, frugality, and humbleness. And these are traits that Preston gained from this first teacher. I've often had fun asking individuals this question. These are especially people that love to read. Where did you get this love for reading? Was it from watching mom and dad at home? Was it from a teacher like Craig? Is it from sharing book titles with your friends? Have you read this book? And what do you think about it? And here we have Preston, frontiersman in a rough area of the frontier, even in the midst of these Indian squabbles and everything else going on, focused on reading. It's amazing. In fact, you can see some of his book purchases here on the screen. Many of them you would recognize. He would order books. Sometimes he would order even more books, like 50 copies at one time of a couple of pamphlets so that he could share them. And whenever he would go to Williamsburg, he would have notes about which books he wanted to buy. And then he would lend them to relatives. But it wasn't just lending them. They would then write letters back and forth about what they thought about, what they were reading. Education was a dominant part of his life also. Listen to this. In 1758, he agreed to take in, and I'm using the words from that time, a bastard child, okay, a young girl. Her name was Elizabeth Evans. And part of his agreement was, unusual for a female orphan, that he would teach her to read and write and cause her to be taught to sew and spin, which was also something women had to learn how to do. But here he was, even when he took an orphan in, taking responsibility to teach her to read and write, when there was no responsibility for him to do that. Now, of course, he wasn't the only one engaged in his education in his family. The Reverend John Brown, his sister Margaret's husband, founded Augusta Academy, which was the forerunner to Washington and Lee University. And he wrote to William about education. And I think this may illustrate some of Preston's views. It's my ambition, he wrote, to give my children education, and if the Lord gives them grace, they may be useful members of society, and if not the contrary. Experience or common observation may teach us that the happiness of ourselves or ours neither lie in riches or education, though they be means, yet they often approve, or what is worse, an incentive device. We'll see this theme in a couple of minutes about the last part. But here is this emphasis on education. At both homes, in Greenfield and Smithfield, he established schools not only for his own children, but he brought in his nieces and nephews. Can you imagine Smithfield? 12 kids, nieces and nephews, coming in also to be there for the school that he's set up for the family. He would often test his new employees. They were often indentured servants or they were prospective assistant surveyors. And his daughter said this: it was always a result with Colonel Preston to require of every young man who was employed in his office to teach school 6 months at least, thereby finding out his temper, diligence, habits, and trustworthiness. I pity the kids when it didn't work out. One of those early teachers was John Floyd, who was an assistant surveyor for him. In fact, I think he was the first teacher at Smithfield. And Preston's daughter, Letitia, actually ended up marrying his son. William also helped to finance the education of other relatives to other schools. His cousin James Thompson, who attended Patrick Henry's school in Hanover, wrote him about the importance of an education. You may depend that I will pursue my education with all the eagerness and ardor that is in my power, and you may depend that I will shun evil company. Every, parents, aunt and uncle's worst fear is the kid will go to Virginia Tech and get into bad company, right? I mean, even back then they were worried about it. And you may depend that I will shun evil company, for in my opinion there is nothing that will corrupt youth sooner and bring them at length to commit the most shocking crimes in nature. But this same cousin that he was giving him money to for his education, look at his expectations here. This is a much more polite place than Augusta. So it is much more expensive. Consider here a great variety of ladies, amongst whom a person is not looked upon unless the dress genteel and make some figure. And the going to balls, which a person that lives here cannot avoid, is expensive. But I hope the time will that I shall be able to make some satisfaction for these expenses. So thanks for the education, but now make sure I look the part, and I can go to the dances, and I can do things that 21st century college students want to spend money on too. He even pushed further and asked if he would send him a horse so that they could see each other more frequently. But we see no response from Preston to that request. Now, when the time came for his older sons to attend college, he wrote asking advice from Granville Smith, his brother-in-law, who had recently attended William and Mary and still lived in Williamsburg. Should they go to Liberty Hall Academy or William and Mary College? Preston also wrote asking whether an acquaintance should continue attending William and Mary, with Smith replying that he didn't feel the man should continue due to, quote, 1,000 alluring temptations to engage a young man to spend his time unprofitably and join in scenes destructive to his constitution interest. He wrote that the college, this is William and Mary College, was not under proper reputations, nor are there here the most eligible set of companions. And then he got to the point, and this is amazing. This is his brother-in-law. I have heard you intend to send your boys to college next year. I very well know how solicitous you are to give them a liberal education, at the same time procure to them the innocence and virtue in which they have been educated. As a friend and relation, I am no less anxious for their prosperity. Therefore, I would wish you would defer sending them for some little time, at least till their judgments are riper, when they will be able to view things and appearances in their proper lights, when they have learnt Latin and Greek enough to enter as regular students in the school of moral and rational philosophy, it will be the best and properest time to send them. At a country school under the direction of a good teacher, they will learn the languages better than at college, for the present professor of humanities, not in my opinion, possessed the most shining abilities. I hope you will not consider that as impertinent. My knowledge of the college induced me to make these observations. Needless to say, Preston's sons didn't go to William and Mary College at that time. Took the advice to heart. Now, at several points in Preston's life, we see values being an important part of this theme that I want to close with this morning. John Brown, who was a pastor, his brother-in-law, reminded Preston early in 1771, you know what, I've jumped ahead of where I wanted to be, and so let me go back to my notes and see where I need to go back and pick up the story. Through this great importance in education, you have to understand the sacrifice that was being made for this to happen. They were having to purchase books. They were having to pay for schooling away from the home. They were taking important employees, like indentured servants and assistant surveyors, away from money-making jobs to educate their children. And yet this frontier family, along with others, were trying to replicate what they had seen in Ireland and what they felt was so important on the frontier. Now, with war raging all around them and neighbors being killed by the Indians, Preston prepared a will in 1777. And illustrating how important he felt education was, he specified that his sons be placed on an equal footing, but then he went on, but should any of them be neglectful about their education or be deficient in point of genius after a proper trial made, it is my will that such son or sons be bound to some genteel trade or calling till they come of age, that they may know how to make a living by their labor. What I like about this is it recognized that some of his sons may not need to go on for education. They may have other skills. Those of us that come from college-educated families have so often so stressed the importance of education in our children that when they're not suited for it, we make them feel guilty, that they're somehow second-class citizens if they don't go on for degrees. Some of you may have children in that situation, and I've seen that. And here you have Preston recognizing this in his estate, which I think is a marvelous insight. Yes, he wants them to be educated, but maybe they're not. And if they're not, make sure they get into a genteel trade. Now, going on with this, his wife Susanna was to superintend the education of their daughters, specifically mentioned in the estate. And making a point in an estate at that time about the education of daughters was not normal in an estate plan. He also specified, now listen to this, that his library would be divided equally among his sons, but who had the first choice? Susanna had the first choice, and not just Susanna, she would pick the first books for Susanna and her daughters, and then the rest would be divided up among the sons. At the end of the, someone has a really fun cell phone message call there. We should have had a colonial theme music right at that time. No problem. At the end of his will, he then comes back to education. I would request a second time that they will do all in their power to give my sons a good education and to prevent them all they can from running into follies and extravagancies to which unguarded youth are but too liable. Now, was his will successful in terms of education? His son, James Pattons Preston, was named after his uncle, was the first child born at Smithfield, had a college named after him in Blacksburg. It was called the Preston and Olin Institute, which became Virginia Tech. One of William's grandchildren became the president of the University of Mississippi, and a great-grandson became the president of Louisiana State University. That's just in the educational area. Of course, all of this accomplishment we talked about was also a result of an excellent education. Now I want to come back to the theme that I jumped ahead to a couple of minutes ago. The values, some of the values that were important to Preston. Here we see John Brown writing to Preston a more theological theme. There is but a narrow passage between death and life, and is attended with such important consequences that it is the greatest wisdom to prepare for a happy eternity. The more of our dear relations that are gone before us ought to be excitements to us to prepare for that grand event. In 1777, he was in the middle of conquests with Indians. his sister Letitia was accusing him of doing some land dealings that hurt her. And you can see here he says, "It is known only to Providence whether ever I shall return or not, but I can freely call my Maker to witness that the interest of that family and their well-being has next to my own children and wife ever lain closest to my heart since their misfortunes, the consciousness of which makes complaints on my conduct sit very heavy on me." But listen to this last sentence. "However, I have one consolation that supports me under the complaints of friends and enemies, and that is the consciousness of my own integrity." His own integrity was a key element in driving so much of his life. And then in 1781, as the Revolution ends, he's very sick. You know, he was a very obese man for a good part of his life. He had trouble even getting on horses sometimes toward the end of his life because of his size. And he had other ailments that were afflicting him. And so now he's in 1781, 2 years from his death, looking back at his life, and this is what he says: "For my part, I can almost cry out, my soul is weary of my life. The loss of less than half a dozen of friends more, exclusive of my family, would make me do so most heartily. Still, I believe it is to be our duty to submit without complaint to the dispensations of Providence, however adverse or disturbing they be appear to our benighted minds." And then he adds this short prayer: "That the God of our fathers may prepare you and I to our connections for this certain change from time to eternity, and that we may cheerfully resign the trouble of this world for the well-grounded hopes of a better." In conclusion, we have seen the making of this frontier elite, several themes: the family modeling, a commitment to public service, the importance of land ownership, the important role of women, the impact of religion in education, the role of values in religion in establishing the almost unparalleled history of one of the most important families in American history. A story known by many of you in this room and by people in this area, but still hidden from the knowledge of most Americans. And may this story continue to inspire us in the legacies that we leave in our families, to our children, to our grandchildren, to our nieces and nephews. Thank you for listening, and it's been a pleasure to relay this story to so many Preston relatives here today.